So today's woman is someone who, if you have been looking at Tudor portraits, at portraits of the court for any kind of length of time, I promise you will have very likely seen something that she did. She was an artist, she was the court painter, and she's very famous for her miniatures. She is Levina Teerlinc, and she painted under four monarchs. And she is such an interesting woman. She was a Flemish painter, and she moved with her husband to England and rose through the ranks. Well, she was actually initially scouted by Henry VIII, and she painted kings, nobility, and like I said, she served under four out of five Tudor monarchs. Her father was a Flemish painter. He specialized in manuscripts, and she also had four sisters. So she was the oldest of five girls, and she was born around 1510. Since her father didn't have a son to train how to paint, he actually trained her how to paint, and she became an expert in miniatures. Now, miniatures were these small portraits. They were designed to be worn in a locket as jewelry. And they were easy to carry. You could move them when you moved from household to household. They were an intimate way to have somebody be close to you. Just like now, we have pictures on our phone and we pull it out and say, oh, look at that. And we like to have those pictures, even though they're backed up somewhere. We still have them. I still have I don't know, 6,000 or something on my phone. So we like to have those things with us. It was the same. Miniatures were kind of a similar thing. Also, they were easy to move around. So ambassadors would carry miniatures of potential brides to each country that they were negotiating marriages for. So that's an example of how they would have been used in an official capacity. Creating a miniature took a lot of skill and patience. The paintings have such detail that she did that it's only when they're really greatly magnified that you can start to see the very tiny brush strokes. And they have shadings. They look so natural. If you just see them like pictures of them online, you wouldn't know they were miniatures. They look like normal portraits, but they're tiny, and they use techniques like stippling and like drawing parallel lines to do shadings. So there were a couple of different techniques that they would have used for that. And it took an incredible amount of skill and just a very steady hand to be able to do that. I don't think I could have done it. I splash mascara all over myself just doing that. So I couldn't have done these tiny things. So it took a lot of skill. Now, her father, like I said, was an illuminator. He made manuscripts, and he probably also trained her in the art of making manuscripts. But of course, it took a similar skill set. The miniature came out of the illuminated manuscripts. When you look at those first letters that are all painted so gloriously with the flowers that are intertwined, and it's a similar kind of thing. So she took that skill and she became a portraitist. One of her most famous miniatures is Catherine Grey. She was the sister to Lady Jane Grey. It depicts not just Catherine and her son was sitting on her lap, but also Catherine was wearing a miniature portrait of her husband. Her husband was in the Tower at the time. They had had an illicit marriage, and they had both spent time in the Tower. This is an important painting on several levels. First, it was the first secular painting of a mother and son in England. It was also the first one to depict a miniature being worn. So it was a miniature within a miniature. And that really showed her skill level, because you can make out it's her husband. You can see that in the miniature. And I have a picture of it in the notes below, so you can check it out. And one of the things about her also is it's difficult to attribute a lot of her works because she didn't sign them. But she was the only Flemish miniature painting at the English court from the time she arrived until her death 30 years later. She was the only miniaturist recorded between the death of Hans Holbein and the rise of Nicholas Hilliard. He would become the most famous miniaturist in the Elizabethan court in the 1570s and beyond. Lavina was so skilled that, like I said, in 1545 she was scouted by Henry VIII. After Hans Holbein died, Henry asked Levina to come to his court. She came to England, her husband came along with her, and she was actually paid a higher starting salary than Hans Holbein was paid by £40. So you can just imagine her skill level to get £40 a year more than what Hans Holbein was getting. And she was really important in the spread of the miniaturist art form. She was likely the author of a work called A Very Proper Treatise, wherein is briefly set for the art in limning, which is another word for miniatures. And that was like a how-to book. That was like a how-to book. And it's also the belief of several art historians that she taught Nicholas Hilliard, who would become the most famous miniaturist of the century. There are documented works of hers that are paintings that are presented as New Year's gifts to the kings, to the king and Edward and then Mary and Elizabeth. There's also an image of the Trinity that she made that was presented to Mary in 1553. She also made numerous portraits of Elizabeth, both individual, herself by herself, and within the court. And one really famous one is an Elizabethan Maundy depicts probably close to 100 people in this tiny little miniature. And she also probably designed the Great Seal of England for Mary and the earliest one used by Elizabeth in the 1540s. As I said, it's difficult to attribute her work. Some scholars believe that a lot of her portraits were lost in the fire at Whitehall that happened in 1698. And then in 1983, the Victoria and Albert Museum actually had an exhibit that was the first occasion where miniatures had been put all together that could all be attributed to her. Like I said, she worked for every Tudor monarch until she died in 1576. She did have a child. She had a son, so she was a mother as well as a career woman. And her career in England spanned 30 years under 4 monarchs, and she was paid better than the men that she worked with often.